On a clear, chilly night in April, the largest vessel ever to float at 800 feet long, displacing 45,000 tons and declared unsinkable by all who had seen her, was gliding through the water with roughly 2,500 peacefully sleeping passengers. Then suddenly it struck an iceberg on its starboard side while moving at 25 knots. The ship was 400 nautical miles from Newfoundland. The ship sank quickly, and due to its insufficient amount of lifeboats, it took a majority of its passengers with it. Now, this story might sound familiar. If you thought it was the Titanic, then you were completely wrong. This is actually a novel, The Wreck of the Titan, written 14 years before the Titanic ever set sail. When you look at the cultural impact that the Titanic has had on the world, after 100 years, people are still talking about this ship. People are still fascinated with it. They romanticize about the mystique and about what happened that night in April. And everybody is curious about what really happened on the Titanic. Why did it sink? Why are there so many mysteries pertaining to the Titanic? And why does it seem like it could have been very, very much preventable? That there was a lot of things that went wrong that initially led to the downfall of the Titanic. For instance, not having enough lifeboats. The fact is that they built the ship and they thought it was going to be unsinkable. And from the get-go, you kind of think that this was almost a doomed ship. This was almost a cursed ship, because before it had left port, it was considered to be unsinkable. And I don't think that's a title you should give to a ship. That's kind of bad foreshadowing, saying, well, this ship is unsinkable, can't be sank. It kind of jinxed itself when you think about that. That they said this ship is so big that not even God itself could sink it. And I think that in itself doomed it from the get-go, because you had the ship going on its maiden voyage, and from the get-go people had foreshadowed that it would actually sink by saying it wouldn't sink. And I think that created this sort of stigma and this bad juju around the fact that this boat wasn't supposed to sink. And like anything, when you say something can't happen, it usually happens. Now, so from the get-go, I think there was this eerie fascination. I had a teacher, third grade teacher, who had told me the story. She said her grandparents actually were scheduled to get on the Titanic. And I forget exactly where at, which stop along when the Titanic picked up passengers. But she said that her grandparents were scheduled to go on the Titanic. Now, before, as they were getting ready to board the Titanic, they seen this guy holding up a sign that said, "Not even God can sink the ship." And people were talking about how this was an unsinkable ship. And something about that gave them an eerie feeling, that almost like they were jinxing this and that they shouldn't be saying that, and that made them feel very bad. And they decided, even though they had bought tickets on the Titanic to travel to America, they decided not to go. And they made the right choice, because obviously the Titanic sank. So I think when you look at the fact that this ship was sort of doomed from the get-go, that in itself is mysterious. Now, a lot of people speculated about what had happened to the Titanic, okay? Because when the Titanic, when the reports of the Titanic after it had sank, the initial report was that it had hit an iceberg, that because of certain weather patterns, it had brought sort of these icebergs down from the North Pole, and that there was a person that was supposed to be looking out for icebergs. He had fell asleep, and they were traveling at 30 knots, and they were going faster than they should have through this ice field, which was a bad thing to do. And as they were traveling through this ice field, they accidentally ran into an iceberg, and it was too late. By the time they had spotted it, they couldn't do anything, and that this iceberg was so big that it had tore into the hull of the ship and gashed these big holes into the side of the ship, which caused it to take on a significant amount of water and caused it to submerge under the water. Now, James Cameron, who actually found the wreckage of the Titanic on several expeditions in a submarine, he went down and actually viewed the wreckage of the Titanic, and he found no evidence to suggest that there had been any gouges or tears in the hull of the ship as once theorized. And another theory is that perhaps it wasn't that the Titanic had these gouges ripped into it, that perhaps these rivets that held these pieces of steel together, that basically made up on the frame of the ship, that these rivets had weakened, and that the iceberg had actually was able to push in the steel plates, and that water was able to seep in the sides, and it would fill up and sink. But that was also disproven because there was no evidence to suggest that as well. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that we know that steel is very strong, and we know that a lot of ice-breaking ships that we have today to break ice in harbors and when ships get stuck and things like that, they are made out of the same type of steel that the Titanic was built out of. And they're very strong. And now when you have a ship traveling at 30 knots and you have a stationary iceberg, you know, because of kinetic energy, the ship would have more power. And essentially, my initial thought is that it would actually break the ice apart, and that the iceberg would have sustained more damage than the Titanic would have because of kinetic energy. Now, if we have to rule out the iceberg didn't sink it, well, was this some sort of insurance scam by the White Star Line company, which had created the Titanic? Because some believed that it wasn't the Titanic that actually sank, but it was the RMS Olympic, which was a sister ship of the Titanic. It was an exact replica, and years prior to the Titanic being built, it had sustained significant damage to the front of the ship, and that the repairs weren't covered by insurance, and that they took a huge loss because of this, and that they believed that they simply patched it up and then sent it out as the Titanic, and because it was had this damage and wasn't repaired properly, that this is why the ship sank, and that they got a huge amount of money from the insurance. And so, you know, is that a possibility? Was the Titanic purposely sank? And that's an interesting theory, is that you find that you have the story of the wreck of the Titan, right? Which I told you about, which mimics the Titanic down to the T. The same amount of passengers died, the same size of ship, on the same month. You know, almost everything is identical to this book that was written in 1898, 14 years before the Titanic. And it's almost like they used this book to set up the agenda for what happened on the Titanic, that this is the answer they gave us to what happened to the Titanic, that they used this as a perfect story to set up the Titanic to sink it. And so some people think that the Titanic was purposely sank, and that someone 14 years ago, before the Titanic had been built, and when this book was written, they read this book, The Wreck of the Titan, and they said, hey, this would be, you know, this is a great idea. We got this big ship, we build this big ship, we sink it, we get the insurance money, and this was sort of some scam thought up by the White Star Line, and that they had the perfect plot, the perfect motive to sink the ship, and everything that they needed was in that book. So is it possible that this was some sort of scam, and that they had used the wreck of the Titan as sort of a plot on how they could sink the ship, and the story that they could give to say what happened, and give this false narrative of what had happened to explain away the sinking of the ship and show that this wasn't a scam, and that it wasn't negligence really on their part, and that they would receive the insurance money. That's a possibility. Now, I would like to get into other theories and think that could the Titanic have been sank by a USO, which is an unidentified submerged object, basically a UFO underwater. And if you've ever seen what steel can do, what one steel object could do to another steel object, you can literally slice it apart. And is it possible that you had this UFO that was underwater traveling at significant speed, okay, and it clips the Titanic on accident and crashes into it, and then you have the Titanic sinking? And what's interesting about the Atlantic is you see a lot of UFO reports that have happened in the past 100 years. It's a hotspot for UFOs and USOs. Is it possible that a UFO was traveling underwater and hit the ship? Or is it possible that a USO, because there wasn't the damage found as to why this thing should have sank, is it possible that this UFO could have emitted some sort of electromagnetic field or something that disrupted the buoyancy of the water and caused this ship to slowly sink and change the compositional makeup of the water to some extent, to where it actually caused the ship to go underwater? And, you know, there are people who say that they had seen weird lights a couple nights prior to the Titanic sinking that were on the Titanic. Survivors had said that they'd seen these weird lights in the sky, these ominous lights, in which several people talk as like a precursor to what was going to transpire. And they said they'd seen these strange hovering orbs in the sky that were sort of following the ship. And people took this as a bad omen, as a bad sign. Could this have been the UFO activity in the area that supports this theory that perhaps the ship was sank by a USO, and that this caused this big ship to go down? I mean, could this have been purposely that the UFOs seen this giant ship and they had no idea what it was, and mistaken it for something dangerous, or thought that it possibly, when it was traveling at such speeds and the lights and stuff, maybe it caused them to fear this as something, as an imminent danger, and that they had fired upon it or something. I think that there is that possibility. This could have been UFOs. This could have been a USO. I think my greatest belief in my biggest theory as to what may have happened to the Titanic, and I think it's possible the Titanic may have been sunk by a sea creature, and specifically the Leviathan, or the creature known as the Leviathan. The Leviathan is mentioned in the book of Job, in the book of Psalms, in the Christian Judaic Bible. It's found in the Torah. It's found in the Bible. There are other cultures, Norwegian culture, right? Thor fights this beast of the water, this giant beast during Ragnarok. And I apologize because I cannot pronounce the name, but he fights this giant water beast. You have Assyrians, Babylonians talking about this fight between a god and this giant water creature. You have this tale from the Canaanites who lived before the Israelites in the land of Israel, who talk about their god Baal fighting this giant beast in the water. And when you hear the description of the Leviathan in the Bible, it describes this creature that is, ginormous and has scales and breathes fire. It sounds like something you would see in a movie. And there's also references in the Jewish scripture that talks about a battle between God and it. That there is this battle between God and the Leviathan and the Behemoth, which the Behemoth is basically this giant creature on land, and the Leviathan is this creature in the sea. And there is this giant battle that takes place at the end of days, and the righteous feed upon the flesh of the Leviathan. And you have several cultures that make reference to this giant sea creature. Seafarers for thousands of years have talked about these ginormous sea creatures that they see in the sea. There are depictions in maps. There are several tales of encounters with these giant sea creatures. And what's interesting is people say that, well, these are mistaken whales or other sea creatures. But you gotta understand, if you're a person who lives on the sea, your whole life is the sea, then you know what a whale is. You know, you've seen whales. You've seen other creatures that reside in the ocean. And so it's probably pretty common for a lot of these seafarers to have seen whales, to know what a whale was. And when they describe something that's bigger than a whale, and you think of something that is actually bigger than a whale, the biggest creature on Earth, then that can put it into an idea of how big a size this Leviathan creature may be. And I find it interesting that scientists, and I think it was back in 2008, they used this hyperbolic mic, which they sent underwater into the Mariana Trench, the deepest part of the ocean in the Pacific. And they heard some very strange sounds that sounded like some sort of creature. And they estimated this creature to be very, very large to make such vocalizations. And some people come forward and said, well, it was a whale. But when you look at how far deep down this is, it's very skeptical to me that this is some sort of whale. And now, if you had a lot of sightings in the Atlantic, when the explorers were coming over here to the Americas, they reported these large sea creatures, and they depicted them as being as big as cities, miles long. And these things coming out of the water and almost like an island shaking the whole sea when they arose from the water. So you could imagine a creature that was almost a mile in length traversing under the water, and it sees this big ship, and it thinks maybe this is a predator or some sort of large fish, and it swims up to investigate and runs into this thing or hits this thing. And also you have reports of a lot of seafarers who were attacked by sea creatures, who took their ships under. And especially in the Atlantic, you have all these reports. I mean, this is where Moby Dick transpired, and where it came out of, this story that these sea creatures would attack ships and actually bring ships under with them. And you have stories of the Kraken and things like that, which reside in the sea and actually take ships under. And I thought it's interesting that you're in the middle of the sea, you're in a very deep part of the ocean where the Titanic sank, which is before the continental shelf. So it's a very deep waters. When you think of how big the ocean is and how we've explored more of space than the ocean, that it's possible there could be some sort of creature that resides under the water that could have potentially taken the Titanic down, that could have ran into the Titanic, could have caused damage to the Titanic. And this would explain what caused the Titanic to sink. And I think it's interesting that we don't really ever talk about this or think about this. Things like potential UFOs or sea creatures, when we have a lot of evidence to suggest this wasn't an iceberg that sank the ship. So why don't we look at other answers? And that, to me, seems like some very plausible answers that we've yet to investigate and figure out what could have caused the sinking of Titanic outside of the plausible natural explanations. Could this have been something supernatural? Well, thank you guys for listening. I'm Parahan.